C.S. Lewis, 1898 to 1963, was not a theologian. So this introduction to Lewis's theological thought is, in one respect, slightly misrepresenting him. He was not a theologian, never claimed to be a theologian, always insisted upon his amateur and lay status. He never officially, formally studied theology, nor did he ever officially or formally teach it at either of his universities. He was an English literature scholar, a literary critic and literary historian specializing in medieval and Renaissance English. He was a fellow and tutor in English at Oxford for about 30 years, and he finished his career as the first professor of medieval and Renaissance English at the University of Cambridge. But he was extremely theologically literate and learned, and he was a devout Christian from the age of about 32 onwards, so he had a very practical, lived engagement with Christianity as a believer. And you put those two things together, his general reading in theology and his active devout faith, you put that alongside his expertise, his official professional expertise in English literature, and you have a very interesting contributor to the theological landscape. So he was born in 1898 in Belfast in Ireland. He was born into an Anglican family. His grandfather had been the Anglican clergyman at the local parish church, where he himself, Lewis, was baptized as an infant, and he was raised in that Christian environment by his law court solicitor father and his mother, who was a graduate in mathematics. Lewis had one older brother, Warren, to whom he was very close throughout his life. So Lewis was raised in this Christian setting, but in his boyhood, when he was about 12 or 13, he abandoned his faith. I think this was partly related to the fact that his mother had died when he was only about 9 years old, and almost immediately after her death, Lewis was sent abroad from France to England to be educated in the south of England. And this was a very unhappy period for him. Not only had he lost his mother, he had been uprooted from his home in Ireland. He was sent to possibly the worst school in England, which was positively Dickensian. The headmaster was later certified insane and died in a lunatic asylum. So Lewis's years from about 10 to 15 or so were very unhappy. He eventually persuaded his father to allow him to be tutored privately. And once he was extracted from the unhappy schooling experiences that he'd been enduring, he began to flourish and thrive under this personal tutor, William Kirkpatrick, who was an ultra-rational, logical atheist. And Kirkpatrick helped put into Lewis a lot of argumentative backbone and rigour. Lewis had been quite a poetically minded, romantically inclined young person, but Kirkpatrick balanced that out with the logic and the rigour and the demand to substantiate any claim he made with evidence and examples. So it was under Kirkpatrick that Lewis began to flourish as a young scholar, and he applied to Oxford and was accepted at University College, Oxford, to read for a degree in classics, a 4-year degree, which was interrupted in Lewis's case by active service in the First World War. Lewis joined the Somerset Light Infantry, was given a commission as a second lieutenant, and arrived in the trenches of France on his 19th birthday in November 1917. He saw active service for about 6 months. Some of those 6 months he was laid up with trench fever, but he recovered from the trench fever in time to face the great German attack and was very severely wounded in the Battle of Arras in the spring of 1918, when ironically a British shell fell short into his trench, killing the man next to him, spattering Lewis full of shrapnel, bits of which he carried around in his body for years afterwards. And he had an out-of-body experience. He looked down on his body from a height, and the thought occurred to him, here is a picture of a man dying. But obviously he didn't die. He recovered. He was invalided back to England, and he spent another 6 months recovering from his war wounds. So by the time Lewis was 20, he had gone through quite a lot. He'd lost his mother, he'd had a very unhappy schooling experience, and he had been nearly killed in the First World War. It's not perhaps surprising that he was rather angry, bitter, questioning. The first book that he ever published was a volume of poetry called Spirits in Bondage, which came out in 1919, just after the end of the First War. And at that time, Lewis was calling himself an atheist. He'd abandoned his childhood faith, and for most of his 20s, he continued in that vein. But a significant moment in his spiritual and theological development occurred in 1926, when he encountered a fellow colleague at Oxford, another young professor by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien, who was an expert in Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic languages, and was a very devout Catholic Christian. Lewis and Tolkien struck up a friendship, and after a few years, Lewis began to call himself a theist. He talks a great deal about the intellectual and philosophical developments which led to his conversion to theism in his autobiography Surprised by Joy, which he published in 1955. But it was not theism that was to prove the end of the road for him in his religious development, but Christianity. And it was in large part owing to the influence of Tolkien and another friend called Hugo Dyson that Lewis eventually converted to Christianity in 1931. Tolkien and Dyson and Lewis had a long nighttime conversation in the grounds of Magdalen College and in the rooms of C.S. Lewis, who was by now a fellow and tutor at Magdalen College, on the subject of Christianity, metaphor and myth. This conversation was life-changing for C.S. Lewis, and a few weeks afterwards he said that he had passed on from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ, and he says that his long nighttime conversation with Tolkien and Dyson had a good deal to do with it. And we know quite a lot about the content of this conversation because Lewis wrote a long letter to another friend, Arthur Greaves, one of his Belfast friends, recounting what it was that they had talked about. Lewis's whole problem with Christianity at this point, so he says to Arthur Greaves, had been a difficulty in knowing what Christianity meant. He said, you can't believe something while you are ignorant what the thing means. His whole problem with Christianity at this point was that he was focusing on Christian doctrines like sanctification and justification and propitiation and phrases like the blood of the lamb, sacrifice. And he said that he could only interpret these phrases, these concepts, in senses which to him were either silly or shocking. But what Tolkien and Dyson said to Lewis was, look, you are a literary man. You have great poetic and imaginative interests. You have long been intrigued by pagan myths of dying and rising gods. And Lewis admitted that this was so. He says in his letter to Greaves that pagan myths of Adonis, Bacchus, Balder, the corn gods, mysteriously moved him. He couldn't say in cold prose what these myths meant, but then he didn't want to. because they were myths and they had to be accepted in their own terms as saying something in a dramatic, symbolic way, and not translated into a set of ideas or concepts, a set of doctrines. But he had been trying to turn Christianity into a set of doctrines. But Tolkien and Dyson said, why not approach Christianity in the same sort of way that you approach the pagan myths, as a story of a dying and a rising God? And once Lewis thought about approaching Christianity from that imaginative point of view as principally a story, as a sequence of events, as a myth, but with this crucial difference that this was a myth with a definite historical claim, it was a huge breakthrough for him. He now began to see that he'd been putting the cart before the horse. He'd been letting the tail wag the dog. He'd been emphasizing doctrines as opposed to myth, as opposed to the story from which the doctrines come. But the doctrines are secondary. The doctrines are ancillary. They help explain the story of Christ, but they are not the story itself. They are less true than that which they are doctrines about. And the primary language, the language that is more adequate than the doctrinal language, is the lived language. The language of an actual man in an actual time, in an actual place, doing actual things. Jesus of Nazareth, crucified under Pontius Pilate, outside Jerusalem in roughly the year AD 33. And once Lewis thought of Christianity as a story, a sequence of events dealing with events and characters in a real time, in a real place, and began to understand that that was the principal meaning that his mind was required to interact with, that was the breakthrough for him. He realized that he had been, up until this point, treating Christianity not so much as a myth, but as an allegory. An allegory is when you translate a story into a secondary set of terms. You need the secondary set of terms in order to translate the initial set. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is the classic example. It's the story of a man escaping from the city of destruction and heading towards the celestial city, but it's not about a literal journey, it's about religious development and a spiritual transformation. And if you don't translate it into the second set of terms, then you're not understanding the story. But Christianity is not an allegory. Christianity does not need to be translated into doctrines. Doctrines are important, yes, they are valuable, they have a role to play, but they are secondary, and they should not be put first. What comes first is the lived language. That is the language more adequate. That there were certain similarities between Christianity and these great pagan myths was not a troubling factor to Lewis any more than it was to Tolkien and Dyson. From the similarities between Christianity and